I'll never understand why Captain Picard didn't save his family in Star Trek Generations. There's a moment in Star Trek Generations that's haunted fans for decades, not because of its tragedy, but because of its utter illogic. When Captain Jean-Luc Picard enters the Nexus, that mysterious pocket of timeless bliss, he is given something he's rarely had in the harsh, star-flung reality of Starfleet, peace, family, legacy. He finds himself in a dream-like domestic utopia, surrounded by a wife and children in a Victorian-style holiday celebration. But the moment collapses. Once Picard realizes this is all an illusion, he gives it up to save the galaxy. But here's the thing I can't shake, even after all these years. Why didn't Captain Picard use the Nexus to save his actual family, his brother Robert and nephew Rene, who had recently died in a fire at the Picard family vineyard? The tragedy of their deaths is central to Picard's emotional arc in Generations. Their loss isn't just a family trauma, it's the obliteration of his personal legacy. And yet, given the opportunity of a magical time-ripping ribbon that lets you go anywhere, anytime, and do anything, Picard chooses to team up with Captain Kirk and punch Malcolm McDowell on a rock. Sure, saving the galaxy is important. But we're talking about the Nexus, a loophole in time and space that makes no logical sense, but exists purely for wish fulfillment. And Picard doesn't even try to save the people he just finished grieving for? It makes no sense, and it never has. A rare glimpse of the man behind the uniform. For 7 seasons of The Next Generation, Captain Picard was defined by his stoicism, intellect, and restraint. Unlike the emotionally volatile Kirk or the fatherly Sisko, Picard was the ultimate diplomat and philosopher. His personal life was a quiet tragedy, no spouse, no children, and a deeply strained relationship with his family back on Earth. His brother Robert disapproved of Jean-Luc's career in Starfleet, and Rene was the bright-eyed young boy who might have one day continued the Picard name. When Picard learns of their deaths in Generations, he's devastated. It's one of Patrick Stewart's finest scenes, utterly raw and real. For once, Picard isn't in control. His grief is about more than loss. It's about finality. He's the last of the Picards. The vineyard is ashes. His bloodline ends with him. So when the Nexus gives him a vision of a family life, it's not random, it's his subconscious screaming for what he's lost. This isn't just escapist fantasy, it's emotional honesty. For a character who's often cerebral, this was the most human he's ever been. But the film doesn't follow through on that humanity. Instead, it shoves Picard back into the uniform and tells him to stop the bad guy. The Nexus, infinite possibility, poorly used. The Nexus is one of those sci-fi devices so ill-defined it becomes dangerous, because if anything is possible in it, then everything is possible. It's essentially a cosmic get-out-of-jail-free card for characters to undo mistakes, relive dreams, or rewrite history. And yet, Generations wastes it. The film pretends to explore the theme of regret and second chances, but ultimately refuses to engage with its own premise. Winan explains that time has no meaning in the Nexus. You can go anywhere anytime. You can leave the Nexus and emerge at any moment you choose. So when Picard finds Kirk in the Nexus and convinces him to help stop Saran Malcolm McDowell, they return to the moment just before Saran launches the missile that would destroy a star. That makes sense, sort of. But it raises the question, why didn't Picard go further back in time? Why not go back to Earth and prevent the fire at the vineyard? Why not go to the moment when Robert and Rene were alive and save them? He doesn't even consider it. And that's what's so maddening. Saving the galaxy versus saving your legacy. Let's be clear, Picard choosing to stop Saran is noble. That's what heroes do. They don't live in fantasy worlds when others are in danger. And yes, stopping the destruction of a star, along with the millions of lives in its system, is a moral imperative. But the timeline of the Nexus allows for nuance. Picard could have saved his family and stopped Saran. He could have exited the Nexus at any point in time. A day earlier. A week earlier. Long enough to dispatch a message to Earth warning of the fire, or even long enough to make the journey himself. Even if he didn't want to alter the timeline too drastically, he could have saved just Rene. He could have used the Nexus not to indulge in a fantasy, but to undo a senseless tragedy. It would have added complexity to the story and to Picard's character. Does he get to be the Starfleet captain and the man who saves his family? Or does duty demand sacrifice? Instead, Generations skips over all of that. The script acts like the only way to use the Nexus is to go right back to the moment you failed. It's a baffling choice, and it reduces the emotional impact of the film's biggest tragedy to nothing more than a setup for a few minutes of existential grief. The ghost of Renee haunts the franchise. The failure to address this choice doesn't just affect Generations, it reverberates throughout the Star Trek canon. When Star Trek, Picard revisits Jean-Luc decades later, his lack of family still weighs heavily on him. The show eventually introduces a new legacy in the form of Jack Crusher, a surprise son with Beverly, but Reen's absence remains a gaping wound in his story. Imagine if Generations had allowed Picard to save his nephew. Think about how that would have shaped his character in Picard. Instead of an old man grappling with the ghosts of a family lost, he could have been someone watching his nephew grow up, possibly even joining Starfleet. The idea of legacy wouldn't be theoretical anymore. It would be real. But instead, the franchise seems to pretend that saving Renee was never an option. That makes Picard's grief feel performative in hindsight. If he could have done something and didn't, what does that say about him? The ethical gray zone Star Trek never explores. One of the most fascinating aspects of Star Trek is its willingness to explore difficult ethical terrain. The Prime Directive, artificial intelligence rights, wartime morality, these are the bread and butter of Trek storytelling. But in Generations, the ethical dilemma is quietly tiptoed around. If you could change the past, would you? For a character as thoughtful as Picard, this should have been the central conflict. He could have debated with Kirk or Guinan or even himself. What if he could save millions and his family? What if saving them meant changing something else? What if duty meant accepting loss? But we get none of that. There's no discussion, no internal struggle. Just a brief goodbye to his fantasy family, and off he goes to punch a villain. It's a disservice not just to the story, but to the character. A missed opportunity for a masterpiece. Star Trek Generations had all the ingredients to be one of the most emotionally resonant films in the franchise. It had grief, legacy, sacrifice, and two of the greatest captains in Starfleet history sharing the screen. But instead of diving into the emotional and moral complexity of time, family, and regret, it takes the safest route possible. It turns the Nexus into a glorified holodeck and Picard into a one-dimensional do-gooder. It robs the audience of what could have been a heart-wrenching choice, saving the galaxy, yes, but not without trying to reclaim the people he loved. Final thoughts. Jean-Luc, you deserve better. Captain Jean-Luc Picard is one of the most beloved characters in all of science fiction, not because he's a perfect hero, but because he's a deeply human one. He doubts, he mourns, he reflects. That's what makes him great.